The wind howled through the dimly lit streets as Michael Jennings, a homeless man in his late 50s, pulled his tattered coat tighter around him. He sat outside La Bella Bistro, a high-end restaurant in downtown Manhattan, watching the well-dressed customers laugh over their expensive meals. He wasn't bitter, just hungry. Then he saw him, a man in his early 40s, tailored suit, Rolex glinting under the streetlights, pacing near the entrance. But something was off. His expression wasn't that of a wealthy businessman enjoying his night. He looked lost. Michael watched as the man checked his pockets, then sighed heavily. No wallet, no phone, nothing. Instinct took over. Michael reached into his own worn-out coat, pulling out a crumpled $10 bill, his last. He hesitated. This money could buy him a meal, or at least a warm coffee. But instead, he stood up, approached the man, and held out the bill. Here, looks like you need this more than I do. The businessman's eyes widened in shock. You're giving this to me? Michael nodded. I know what it's like to be down on your luck. The man stared at the bill, then at Michael. And for the first time in a long time, Michael saw something in a rich man's eyes that he never expected: genuine gratitude. Little did he know, this moment would change everything. The businessman hesitated, staring at the crumpled bill in Michael's outstretched hand. For a moment, he seemed speechless. Then, shaking his head, he gently pushed Michael's hand back. I can't take this, he said, his voice filled with something that sounded like shame. You need it more than I do. Michael chuckled dryly. Doesn't look that way to me. The businessman exhaled, rubbing his forehead. My wallet was stolen. My phone's dead. I have no cash, no way to call anyone. I just needed to sit down and think. Michael studied him. He had seen men like this before, powerful, polished, untouchable. But now, this man looked fragile, vulnerable. Michael smiled. Everyone needs help sometimes, even guys in fancy suits. The businessman's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Then, reluctantly, he took the bill. Thank you, he said. What's your name? Michael. The businessman nodded. Michael, let me repay you. Tomorrow, meet me here at noon. I promise it'll be worth it. Michael raised an eyebrow. Rich men always made promises, and they rarely kept them. Still, he shrugged. All right, but if you don't show, no hard feelings. The businessman smiled, slipping the bill into his pocket. I'll be here. Michael watched as he walked inside, disappearing into the warmth of the restaurant. He shook his head, chuckling to himself. What a strange night. Little did he know, this was just the beginning. The next day, Michael sat on the same cold bench outside La Bella Bistro, watching the world pass him by. He had been here before, waiting on promises that never came. Rich men always said they'd help, but in the end, they disappeared. Still, he waited. Noon came, then 12:15, then 12:30. Michael sighed, pulling his coat tighter. Figures. He should have known better. Hope was a dangerous thing. Then, footsteps. Sharp, confident. Michael looked up, and there he was. The businessman. Clean suit, polished shoes, but this time, a smile on his face. Told you I'd be here. Michael raised an eyebrow. Figured you had better things to do. The man shook his head. Not today. He reached into his pocket and pulled out $100 bill, crisp and new. Michael's stomach clenched. He had seen this before. Rich men throwing money at their guilt. But before he could refuse, the businessman held up a hand. This isn't charity. This is lunch. My treat. Michael hesitated. Pride and hunger waged war inside him. Finally, He exhaled and took the bill. All right, but if we're eating, I'm choosing the place. The businessman grinned. Deal. They walked down the street, side by side. Two men from different worlds. But today, they were just two people sharing a meal. And Michael had no idea just how much this lunch was about to change his life. Michael led the businessman down the street, away from the polished restaurants and high-end cafes. He knew exactly where he wanted to go. A small, hole-in-the-wall diner sat on the corner, its neon sign flickering. The place wasn't fancy, but it was warm, and they didn't look twice at people like him. The businessman chuckled as he took in the worn-out booths and faded menu. Not exactly five-star dining. Michael smirked. Nope, but the coffee's strong and the food's real. They slid into a booth, and a waitress, an older woman with tired eyes but a kind smile, poured them both a steaming cup. Michael savored the warmth. The businessman took a sip and nodded. You were right. This is good. Michael shrugged. Told you. They ordered, Michael getting his usual eggs and toast, the businessman opting for a burger. As they ate, conversation flowed. Michael spoke about life on the streets, the jobs he used to have, the family he lost. He kept it light, but the businessman listened intently, asking questions no one had ever cared to ask. Then, Michael turned the tables. What about you? What's your story? The businessman hesitated, then sighed. You ever build something from the ground up, only to wonder if you lost yourself along the way? Michael frowned. That wasn't the answer he expected. Before he could press, the businessman smiled. Forget it. Just an old habit. Thinking too much. Michael studied him. There was more to this man than expensive suits and fancy watches. And soon, he was about to find out just how much more. Michael stared at the phone screen, his mind racing. Ethan Calloway. The name sounded familiar now. Headlines, interviews, stories about a self-made billionaire who had built an empire from nothing. And now, here he was, sitting across from a man who had spent his last $10 on him. Ethan watched Michael's reaction carefully. You recognize me now, don't you? Michael exhaled sharply. Yeah. Can't say I expected to have breakfast with a billionaire today. Ethan chuckled. Me neither. Michael leaned forward. So what now? You pay for my meal and disappear back to your mansion? Ethan shook his head. Actually, I wanted to ask you something. Michael narrowed his eyes. Rich men never asked for anything. They took. Ethan placed his phone on the table. You said something yesterday that stuck with me. Everyone needs help sometimes. Michael shrugged. Yeah. So? Ethan's gaze was steady. I think I need yours. Michael laughed dryly. Right. What could a guy like me possibly do for you? Ethan folded his hands. Come work for me. Michael blinked. What? Ethan smirked. You heard me. Michael shook his head. I don't even have a home, man. What the hell could I do in a billion-dollar company? Ethan leaned in. You see things my employees don't. You understand people in a way my executives never will. I need someone who can tell me the truth. Someone who knows what it's like to struggle. Michael scoffed. And what? You're just gonna hand me a job? Ethan's expression turned serious. Not just any job. A second chance. Michael stared at him, heart pounding. For years, doors had been slammed in his face. And now, one was wide open. But could he really trust it? Michael sat back, arms crossed, staring at Ethan like he had just spoken another language. A job? With a billionaire? It had to be a joke. You don't even know me, Michael finally said. Why would you offer me a job? Ethan didn't flinch. Because I trust my instincts. And my instincts tell me you see things others don't. Michael let out a dry laugh. Yeah? And what exactly do I see? Ethan's voice was calm but firm. Reality. Michael frowned. I built my company from the ground up, Ethan continued. But lately, I feel like I've lost touch with the people who make it run. I sit in boardrooms, I read reports, but I don't see what's really happening at the ground level. Michael shook his head. And you think I do? Ethan nodded. You notice details. You read people. You understand what it's like to struggle. That's something no Ivy League degree can teach. Michael's hands curled into fists. He had struggled. He had begged for work, for a second chance, only to be ignored. And now, a billionaire was just handing him one? It didn't feel real. Michael exhaled. And what if I say no? Ethan shrugged. Then we shake hands. I thank you for the best breakfast I've had in years, and we go our separate ways. No pressure, no ultimatums. But the opportunity sat there, waiting. Michael's stomach twisted. For the first time in a long time, someone saw value in him. But could he take that leap? Michael stared at Ethan, searching for the catch. There had to be one. Rich men didn't just offer jobs to homeless guys off the street. So, what exactly would I be doing? Michael finally asked. Ethan smirked. Whatever you do best, observing, telling me what's wrong, helping me fix it. Michael scoffed. You're seriously hiring me to point out problems? Ethan leaned forward. I'm hiring you to show me what no one else will. Michael ran a hand through his unkempt hair. This was insane. He hadn't had a real job in years. The thought of stepping into some corporate world felt like walking into a place he didn't belong. But something about Ethan's confidence, the way he wasn't looking at Michael like a project, but as an asset, made the offer feel real. Michael sighed, shaking his head. You really think I can do this? Ethan's eyes didn't waver. I wouldn't offer if I didn't. Michael exhaled. His whole life had been one rejection after another. Doors slamming in his face. People looking through him like he didn't exist. And now, a door was wide open. Finally, he reached across the table. All right, Calloway. I'm in. Ethan grinned, shaking his hand. Good. You start tomorrow. Michael laughed dryly. Great. Do I at least get a shower first? Ethan chuckled. Already arranged. Michael blinked. This guy really had thought of everything. For the first time in a long time, Michael had something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Michael stood in front of the mirror, barely recognizing himself. His hair was trimmed, his beard cleaned up, and the fresh set of clothes fit him better than anything he had worn in years. It felt strange. For so long, he had grown used to blending into the background, being invisible. Now, he looked like someone who belonged. Ethan walked up behind him, adjusting his own tie. Looking sharp, Michael smirked. Don't get used to it. Ethan chuckled. Come on, first day. Let's see what you can do. They arrived at Calloway Enterprises, a towering glass building that loomed over the city. Michael felt small just standing in front of it. He wasn't supposed to be here. But then, Ethan clapped a hand on his shoulder. Relax. Just be yourself. Michael took a breath and stepped inside. The lobby was polished, sleek, expensive. Employees in tailored suits walked past, barely acknowledging him. Michael's eyes darted around. He had been ignored before, but here, it was different. These people weren't cold. They were afraid. He glanced at Ethan. You sure you're running this place? Ethan frowned. Why? Michael nodded toward a group of employees whispering near the elevators, stealing nervous glances at them. Because they looked terrified of you. Ethan followed Michael's gaze, his expression darkening. Michael wasn't just here to observe. He was here to uncover the truth. Michael followed Ethan through the sleek glass corridors of Callaway Enterprises, taking in everything. The pristine floors, the hushed whispers, the way employees stiffened when Ethan walked by. He could feel it. Something was off. At the front desk, a young receptionist, barely in her 20s, straightened her posture as Ethan approached. Her smile was tight, forced. "Good morning, Mr. Callaway." Ethan nodded. "Morning, Sarah. How's everything today?" She hesitated, just for a second, then forced the same fake smile. "Great, sir." Michael saw it. The same look he had seen in people just trying to survive. The kind of look you gave when you had no other choice. Ethan didn't seem to notice, but Michael did. They took the elevator to the top floor, the executive suite, a space so polished it barely felt real. Ethan gestured to an office. "This will be your workspace." Michael raised an eyebrow. Not bad for a guy who was sleeping on a bench yesterday. Ethan smirked. "Told you. I keep my word." Michael leaned against the desk. "All right, boss. Where do you want me to start?" Ethan folded his arms. "Tell me what's wrong with my company." Michael grinned. "You sure you want that answer?" Ethan nodded. "That's why you're here." Michael glanced out the window, then back at Ethan. "All right, let's find out what's really going on." Michael spent the day walking the halls of Callaway Enterprises, watching, listening, piecing things together. It didn't take long to confirm what he had suspected. People weren't just intimidated by Ethan. They were afraid. Whenever Ethan passed, employees lowered their heads, avoided eye contact, forced smiles. It wasn't respect. It was survival. Michael leaned against a desk in the break room, casually striking up conversation with a group of junior employees. "So, what's it like working here?" Silence. They exchanged nervous glances, like they were being watched. Finally, one of them, a woman in her 30s with tired eyes, muttered under her breath, "You don't ask questions here." Michael frowned. "Why not?" She hesitated, then looked around the room before whispering, "Because people who do, don't last long." Before he could press, a voice cut through the room. "Excuse me, what are you doing here?" Michael turned to see a tall man in his 50s, expensive suit, sharp glare. Anthony Whitmore, Chief Operating Officer, second in command. The room fell silent. Employees scattered. Michael could feel the tension shift instantly. "I'm Michael," he said, holding out a hand. "I work for Ethan." Whitmore didn't take it. "I wasn't informed of any new hires." Michael smirked. "Guess you weren't paying attention." Whitmore's gaze darkened. "You should be careful who you talk to." Michael held his ground. Something was very, very wrong in this company, and he was about to find out just how deep the corruption went. Michael left the break room, Whitmore's cold stare burning into his back. Something was off about that guy. Too smooth, too controlled. Michael made his way toward Ethan's office, but as he turned a corner, he heard hushed voices from a nearby meeting room. He paused, listened. "He's watching us." A man's voice, low, tense. "Ethan?" A woman this time. Or the new guy? Both. Michael's pulse quickened. "I told you. We have to be careful. If Callaway finds out what's really going on." The voices dropped lower, but Michael caught one last thing. "We need to handle this before he digs too deep." Michael stepped back, keeping his expression neutral. He had worked the streets long enough to recognize a threat when he heard one. And right now, he was in the middle of something much bigger than he had realized. As he walked away, one thing was clear. Someone inside Callaway Enterprises had a secret, and they were willing to do anything to keep it hidden. Michael stepped into Ethan's office, shutting the door behind him. He wasn't sure how much Ethan actually knew about his own company. But one thing was clear. Something was very wrong. Ethan glanced up from his desk. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Michael didn't waste time. "You have a problem." Ethan leaned back, arms crossed. "Let me guess, Whitmore?" Michael nodded. "Him? And a whole lot of other people. Your employees aren't just afraid of you, Ethan. They're afraid of something bigger. Something they won't talk about." Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. "I had a feeling, but I needed someone who could see it from the outside." Michael sat down. "Well, here's what I saw. People are scared to speak up. There are hushed conversations happening behind closed doors. And I just overheard something that sounded like a warning. Someone inside your company is hiding something from you." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Do you know what?" Michael shook his head. "Not yet, but I know where to look." Ethan studied him, then nodded. "All right, do what you have to do. But be careful." Michael smirked. "I've been careful my whole life, Calloway. Maybe it's time someone else started worrying." As he left the office, one thought echoed in his mind. He was getting close. Too close. And whoever was behind this, they weren't going to let him keep digging for long. Michael spent the next few days watching, listening, piecing things together. Something was happening behind the scenes at Calloway Enterprises, and whatever it was, Whitmore was at the center of it. Every time Michael walked into a room, conversations died. Emails disappeared from screens. People were covering their tracks. Then, late one evening, Michael overheard something that made his stomach drop. "It's taken care of. He won't be around much longer." Michael's blood ran cold. Were they talking about him? That night, as he left the office, he noticed a black SUV idling across the street. The same SUV he had seen the night before. Michael's instincts screamed at him. He was being watched. He turned and walked the opposite way, blending into the city crowd. If they were planning something, he needed to move first. The next morning, Michael walked straight into Ethan's office and shut the door behind him. "It's worse than you think," he said, his voice low. "And I don't have much time." Ethan's expression hardened. "Tell me everything." Michael took a deep breath. "I think someone's trying to take you down from the inside." Ethan's face darkened. "Who?" Michael leaned forward. "Whitmore. And he's not working alone." Ethan exhaled sharply, rubbing his jaw. "I had my suspicions, but I need proof." Michael nodded. "Then let's get it." They devised a plan. If Whitmore and his people were planning something, Michael would make them believe their plan was working. That night, Michael sent an email from an anonymous account. "I know what you've been doing. Meet me at the docks. Midnight. No more games." By 11:45 p.m., Michael was already there, hiding in the shadows, a small recording device in his pocket. At exactly midnight, a black car pulled up. Whitmore stepped out, his face tight with tension. A second later, another man followed. A high-ranking financial officer from Calloway Enterprises. Michael's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about workplace intimidation. This was a conspiracy. "The old man's getting too close," the financial officer muttered. "We need to move before he finds out about the offshore accounts." Michael's breath hitched. "Offshore accounts?" Whitmore nodded. "We'll handle it. By the end of the week, Calloway will be forced out." Michael pressed his back against the wall. He had them. The evidence was right here. But before he could slip away, a voice cut through the night. "You shouldn't have come here." Michael turned and saw two security guards stepping out of the shadows. They had been expecting him. Michael's heart pounded as the security guards advanced. He had the evidence. But if he didn't get out of here, it wouldn't matter. Think. Fast. Whitmore smirked. I warned you, didn't I? Michael lifted his hands in surrender, subtly pressing the record button on his phone. He needed every word of this. The financial officer sneered. You should have stayed in the shadows where you belong. Michael chuckled. You know, that's the thing about shadows. You never know who else is listening. At that moment, headlights flooded the docks. A black SUV screeched to a stop. Ethan Calloway stepped out. Whitmore's face drained of color. What? How? Ethan held up his phone. You sent the email. But Michael copied me. Whitmore's expression twisted in rage. You think you can stop this? We own this company now. Ethan took a step forward. No, you stole it. And now you're done. From the SUV, uniformed officers stepped out. Michael smirked. Guess who else got a copy of the recording? Whitmore turned to run, but the police were already on him. As he was dragged away, he screamed, You'll never fix this. Ethan turned to Michael, nodding. Let's find out. Michael took a deep breath. For the first time in years, he wasn't running. He had a future. And this was just the beginning. Ethan placed a firm hand on Michael's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had just accomplished. The corruption was exposed, justice was served, and Calloway Enterprises was finally back in the hands of the man who built it. But this wasn't just about a company, it was about redemption. Michael looked up at the towering skyscraper, the very place that once seemed like an unreachable world. Now, he belonged here, not as a beggar, not as an outsider, but as a man who had proven his worth. Ethan smirked. So, you still think you don't belong? Michael exhaled, a slow smile spreading across his face. Ask me again in a year. And as they walked toward the building, side by side, as equals, Michael knew one thing for certain. The past was behind him, and for the first time in his life, the future was his to shape.